So, good evening and welcome to everyone. Want to say thank you for joining us. My name is Nathan, and I am the Church Engagement and Campaigns Officer here at the Joint Public Issues team. It is a privilege to be your host for today's webinar. Before we dive into the discussion, I want to extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you and thank you again for the time that you've taken up to join us. It's truly fantastic to see you all here, ready to engage in an important discussion about the upcoming general election. Whether you're joining us from the comfort of your home or office, we're honoured to have you with us. This session is designed to equip you with the information and tools you need to engage in the election. Your presence here today demonstrates your commitment for faith to play a pivotal role in the public space, and for that, we are incredibly grateful. But before we jump into the agenda, I want to encourage each of you to actively participate throughout the session. It would be great to start off by letting us know in the chat your full name, the church or organization you are representing, and where you are making the call from, and your constituency that you represent. So Annie's going to submit those three points into the chat for you now. So your name, the church or organization you're representing, and the area or constituency you live in. So we want to encourage your active engagement in this evening's webinar. We're going to be providing you with some information. You are more than welcome to ask questions and contribute during the webinar, but we do want to say that we're going to provide a healthy space for questions at the end of the webinar. Just to say as well, this session will be recorded. However, the recording will only capture the video of those who are spotlighted. So you do not have to worry if you do not want to be in the recording. And at the end of the webinar, we will stop the recording for the Q&A sessions so that you can speak to the questions if you do not want to write the question in the chat. So if we dive right into what we'll be reflecting on today. So we're going to have three sections to our webinar today. The first section will be focusing on love and how we can show our love for our neighbours as we approach the general election, through the issues we raise as a team here at JPIT and the things we consider as we prepare to vote. And that will be presented by Simeon Mitchell, who is our team leader. The second section of our time together today will be how can we appropriately include the election how can we appropriately pray during the election as we reflect on our prayers, preaching and worship over the months ahead, and that will be presented by Annie. And third and finally, we'll be reflecting on how we can encourage participation in the general election and with good listening and provide spaces for debate as we prepare to cast our votes. And that will be presented by Rue and Steve. I'm just mindful that we will need the presentation up as well as I hand over to Simeon, who will be sharing next.
Thank you very much, Nathan, and I extend my my welcome to you as well. My name's Simeon Mitchell, and I'm the team leader of the Joint Public Issues team. I've been part of the team for the past 6 and a bit years, and it's really good to be here with you this evening thinking about the general election, which feels like it has been on the horizon for a long time, but has not yet been called. But we know it's going to happen at some point before January of next year. So we framed around our resources this year around this lovely phrase, love, pray, vote. And I'm going to talk particularly about the first of those. And we call this section Love, as it's about how we can live out our calling to love our neighbours as we approach the election, particularly through the issues that we raise and the things that we consider as we prepare to vote. Now, as a group of church denominations and as the Joint Public Issues team, the top issue that we want to put on the agenda for this election is poverty. poverty in the UK in particular. Why? Well, I'm sure we've all been affected by the rises in the cost of living over the last couple of years. Those increasing prices, costs of energy and of food and of housing have had huge impacts across our society, but particularly on those who are least well off. But it's important to understand that the current cost of living crisis is not a crisis in isolation. It's come on the back of a decade of austerity, of benefit reforms and cuts, topped by those 2 years of pandemic. And the result is a situation today where 1 in 5 members of our communities are currently experiencing poverty. To see how this is affecting people, we only have to look at the phenomenal growth in food bank use over the last decade. These are figures from the Trussell Trust, which represent about half of all the UK food banks. But the important thing to note here is the trend. You can see that as poverty has got deeper, food banks have increasingly become the safety net that the social security system is no longer providing. And many food bank users are people who are in work. Neither work nor benefits are providing people with enough to live. A second illustration of that has been the return of destitution to our streets and to our communities. To be classed as destitute, someone has to lack the basics to be kept warm and dry, clean and fed. And you can see from the figures here, nearly 4 million people, including now over 1 million children, are currently experiencing this form of absolute poverty in this country, in the UK, the 5th or 6th wealthiest country in the world. That's a number that's tripled in 7 years. So poverty has really been on the rise. It's become deeper, it's become more entrenched. And as a result, many people have faced awful choices and do face awful choices. Around half of adults who are receiving universal credit now say they're regularly skipping meals because they can't afford them. There are record numbers of homeless families with children. And I'm sure many of you and your churches are really aware of this in your communities and are involved in responding to the needs that are exhibited, whether that's food banks, debt counselling centres, warm welcomes, all other kinds of social concern. The churches tend to be very good at that kind of response, even though resources are now really stretched thin. But one of the favourite quotes that we often find ourselves using in JPIT is this one from the great Desmond Tutu. There comes a point when we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And the reality is that the levels of poverty and inequality we're seeing in our society in the UK are the result of political choices and systemic injustices. And if political decisions are at the root of a problem, they should be central to the solution too. So while poverty is currently a huge problem in our country and causing immense harm, it's not inevitable. As Christians, we believe it's not what God wants for people's lives. And as campaigners, we recognise it's a consequence of political choices and priorities. But at the moment, our political leaders don't seem to be rising to this challenge. Across the spectrum, we hear very little from them about their ambitions to end poverty, and very little about the practical plans that show that those life and death issues are being taken seriously. So that's why we feel we need to get poverty onto and then up the political agenda. And so our churches have, over the last year, been part of putting together Let's End Poverty, a new movement that seeks to build the public and the political will to tackle poverty in the UK as we go into the next election. So we've been joining with local groups, with people with lived experience of poverty, charities, trade unions, individuals, faith groups, and all sorts of others to try and get poverty much higher up the agenda. So if you're not yet signed up to that, do go to the website. This address seems to have disappeared, but it's letsendpoverty.co.uk is where you need to go to sign up to become part of that movement, see the ways that you might be involved and kept informed of the latest updates. So as well as pointing out Let's End Poverty and commending that, there are three particular resources that we want to highlight in particular this evening to help you put poverty on the agenda in this election. The first is a course for small groups, which is called Act on Poverty. It's possible that some of you will have seen it already because we started promoting it at the end of last year and some people ran it as a Lent course. The feedback's been really encouraging and really excellent, and I hope that might encourage you, if you've not looked at it, to think about using it at some point over the coming months. It's a resource that we developed with our friends at Christian Aid and Church Action on Poverty and a few other partners. And over 6 sessions, it explores the realities of poverty in the UK and in other parts of the world, how the Bible might inspire and encourage us to act in response, and includes really good audiovisual resources as well as lots of practical support for actions that we might take as small groups in particular within churches. So that's one resource we have on offer. The next is a guide to engaging your candidates in a conversation about poverty. As part of Let's End Poverty, we want every candidate standing for election this year to have the opportunity to discuss poverty with local people who have this as a concern and an interest, and probably from their own experience. In the period leading up to elections, for understandable reasons, political parties and political candidates are particularly keen to listen to and engage with potential voters. So it's a good opportunity to raise issues of concern and to seek commitments at this point. And that's particularly true, I think, with this election, where all the indications are that it's going to be closely fought. Lots of seats could change hands. The polls are suggesting it could bring a change in government. And there are boundary changes which are affecting 9 out of 10 constituencies and lots of MPs standing down. So we're likely to see lots of new MPs elected. Many of those candidates have already been selected and they're looking to build their profile and establish themselves locally. So we often will be thinking about opportunities to raise issue with candidates at hustings or when they come knocking on your door in the election campaign period itself. But while those opportunities are important, and we'll be talking a bit more about them in a moment, in a way they come too late to have any significant influence over what's offered by parties and by candidates. So our advice is not to wait for the frenetic period of the election campaign itself, but to start now in reaching out to some of those candidates and seek a meeting to talk about poverty in particular. And to do that in the form of a private meeting, because that gives an opportunity to present your case, to get to know them, to have a quality discussion and avoid the kind of political point scoring of a campaign. It'll also help you to establish an early relationship with your candidate that you can then hopefully follow up after the election if they are the one that's elected. So there's a guide on the Let's End Poverty website that takes you through the steps that you might take to plan a meeting and ensure it goes well. So then the third of the resources that we have is a much simpler one. It's a banner. Let's End Poverty banners are now available to buy, to display outside your church, to make very visible your support for this campaign and for this issue of poverty in the UK and globally. We found that the churches that have bought these and put them up have found them a really good conversation starter. It gets people thinking in the community about why is the church concerned about poverty, and why is poverty an issue that we want to raise up the political agenda at the moment. So I would invite you to think about whether your church has got a spot where this banner could go, and if so, go to the website to order one for yourselves. We're getting towards the end of this section, but before I finish, I want to acknowledge that while poverty is an important issue, it's not the only issue that is of concern, will be of concern to you and to churches as a whole. As many of you will be aware, JPIT, the Joint Public Issues team, is guided by 6 hopes for society, hopes which are rooted in the Bible, in kingdom values, and these shape our work and our work programs. One of them is around poverty and a hope for a society where the poorest and the most marginalized are at the center. But we have 5 other areas of focus, refugees and asylum issues, which are huge issues politically at the moment. The environment and the climate crisis, which is the backdrop to all of our lives. The economy and the hope for a just economy that enables the flourishing of all life. Peace, and obviously issues around peace and conflict are very present in our news and in our world at the moment. And finally, we have a hope around politics itself, and that politics will be characterized by listening, kindness, and truthfulness. So to resource people, resource you in thinking about different issues in this election, we've put together an election issues briefing, which is focused around those 6 hopes. And for each of them, it sets out very briefly why that issue is one of concern to Christians, and some of the key issues at stake in the election. And it also suggests 3 questions that you might ask candidates, either if you're going to a hustings or if they come and knock on your door. And we hope you find that a helpful resource as you reflect on the issues that are important to you and to your community as you seek to love your neighbours during this election campaign and beyond. I'm sure you've got questions and comments, and we'd encourage you to put those in the chat. We're going to have a time at the end when we'll gather all those up, but before you forget them, do pop them in the chat. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Annie Sharples, who's one of our JPIT interns, who's going to talk us through the section on prayer. Thank you, Annie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie and I'm the JPIT intern for this year. So I'm just going to run through some of the things we'll be offering to help you and your churches engage with the election, mainly in your preaching and your praying. So a couple of things that we're already doing, which you might be aware of. We have a weekly podcast called Politics in the Pulpit, which is our main lectionary resource. And it pulls themes of justice out of the readings for the coming Sunday, connecting them to issues that are currently in our news. And these episodes come out weekly every Tuesday. So hopefully that's in time for people to listen and be inspired before they're planning their services. So that will continue during the election period, and we'll do a particular focus on the election and the issues that will be around that. So that will continue. And then another resource, which again we're already doing, is our daily prayers for justice and peace. They go out every morning by email and on our social media channels. And then we also collate these every week as prayers of intercession and put them on our website. So as I said, we'll continue these, and when the election is called, and particularly in the week of the election, we'll be praying more specifically, probably for kind politics and the main issues of the election this year. And then just one thing that we're hopefully we will be doing is we're going to make a prayer guide, which will outline some specific areas to pray during the election period, focusing on our 6 hopes. And as I said, hopefully praying that the politics will be kind and founded on listening and truthfulness, as well as the issues that are likely to be major focuses for the political parties. So I think we're going to go into breakout rooms. We're going to model the praying. And Rue is going to put you into breakout rooms of about 7 or 8 people. So we just invite you to spend time reflecting and praying together. You can do this out loud or in silence together, or pray in the chat function. And there's also on the screen, there's a QR code to a Jamboard where you can put your prayers on as like little sticky notes, and then all of our prayers will be together in one place. So maybe you can pray about things that are on your hearts and minds globally, nationally, and then locally in your constituencies. And I'll also put the link to the Jamboard in the chat as well, so you don't have to scan the QR code if you can't or don't want to. And then I'll also put a prayer in the chat that you can read through together. And then you'll have about 7 minutes in your breakout rooms, and then we'll come back together and hear from Rue and Steve about voting but the Jamboard will remain open. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat. So that's the Jamboard link, and then this is the prayer that we would invite you to read together if you wanted to. Okay, there you go.
Great. Okay, I think everyone's back in the room now. Annie was going to say something, but Annie's disappeared, so I will just continue. Okay, so we're going to try in our next section to think about some of the practicalities of what it means to be engaging people, people in your churches, in your congregations, and people in your neighborhoods and your wider locality in the elections, and think really practically about those things. So let me scroll on. There we go. And my first question was, and you might think this is a bit of a random question, but it's a useful one to think about. Are you yourself 100% sure you are registered to vote? And the reason I asked that is because I had a really great conversation, a podcast conversation with a young person who was really excited because it was going to be their first chance to vote. They were just about to turn 18, and they were talking about enthusiastically about how they were going to be really diligent about who they were going to vote for. They were going to read all the material, and they were going to tell all their friends at school about it, and to get them to be encouraged as well to vote. And we had a great conversation for about 20 minutes, and then I just said at the end, "Are you sure you're registered to vote?" And she came back to me straight away, a little bit embarrassed, and said, "Actually, I don't think I am registered to vote yet." And I said, "Did you know you can vote whenever, or you can register to vote at 16 in England, 14 in Wales, and 14 in Scotland?" She had no idea. She thought she had to turn 18 before she could do that. And this was someone who was really switched on and really enthusiastic about elections and about politics. Imagine what it must be like for people in your congregations or in your community who are not really that switched on about politics and not really that enthusiastic about it. What's the likelihood that some of them are not registered to vote either? So that wasn't quite as random a question as you might think. It's really rooted in reality for many of us. You might find there are people who weren't even aware that they had to register to vote. And the QR code on the screen, if you're the kind of person who knows what to do with those, if you can scan it, it'll take you to a website that'll help people to get registered. And you can also get those links on our website as well. Our resources are available there too. You might be surprised to hear 8 million eligible voters may not vote in the next general election because they didn't register to vote in time. Can you imagine that? 8 million voices that are not heard, are not being heard because they weren't registered. And as churches, we should be able to do something about that. As people who really believe that everyone matters, that every unique person should have a voice and should be heard, that their concerns should be attended to. As churches, we should be people who are encouraging our communities to have a voice, to make sure that those who are often voiceless are actually heard. And there's some really stirring stats around this, but some of the key things to just bear in mind, and perhaps as I read out these groups, these people groups, why don't you just try and picture some of these groups in your own mind? Are there people who you know who come to mind for you that would apply in this case? You're at greater risk of not being able to participate in the democratic process if you rent your home, have moved recently, live in an economically disadvantaged community, are young, are from an ethnic minority, or you're a non-UK national. So there may be people in all of those groups that you can think of in your area. And it's worth sometimes just asking in an unobtrusive way, in an unthreatening way, are you registered to vote? And then maybe if they're not sure, you can do something to help them. One of the big ways we'd love churches to be involved in this is to become a voter registration champion. Now, all of our churches at denominational level, so our Baptist churches, our URC, and our Methodist Church, we have joined a scheme from Citizens UK, which is called the Voter Registration Ambassadors. We are ambassadors for this, and we're encouraging each of our local churches to become champions of this. Now, unfortunately, you don't get a medal for being a champion in the same way that as ambassadors, we didn't get a big stack of Ferrero Rocher to spread around, which I'm a bit disappointed with, but not to worry. So voterchampion.org.uk is the place to go to do this, to register as a voter registration champion. And you might say, why? We've got enough things that we're registered to, enough things that we're attached to. We really don't need another thing to have to do in our church. We've got enough, thank you. And sometimes I would agree with you. But in this case, it seems to me a really, really straightforward form. And it's not got a huge ask. There's no cost involved with it, except maybe just to do a little bit of planning around asking your congregation if they're 100% sure they're registered to vote. And there's different ways that you can be involved in doing that, making it really fun activity, perhaps having a service in your church coming up to the general election, maybe, where you're praying for your candidates, you're praying for the election process, you're thinking about it, you're maybe preaching around the importance of listening to voices in our communities and all kinds of different things. All of these things are great. But to be registered on our voter registration champion network means that you'll be able to get a little bit more support and a bit more encouragement in that way. So if people are giving it out for free, why not just register for that and see the good stuff that can come from that, and encourage your church to be a voter registration champion. It would make a huge difference if you're even just asking your congregation to be involved in this. But then again, past Sunday, thinking about the rest of the week, maybe you have a church building and it's used for lots of different activities during the week. How else could you be a really positive influence to people? Just asking that question, are you registered to vote? And if they're not, or they're not sure, giving them the opportunity to do that. There's lots of different ideas about how you could do that practically. There's ways you could do it, providing bits of paper that they could fill in, and also digital versions as well, pointing them to a QR code and to the website where they can fill in their details there. We've tried to make this as really straightforward as possible because we know what it's like. There's so much on for people. This is a really straightforward as we can possibly make it, to enable people and encourage people to be registered to vote. If they're not registered to vote, they're not going to have that voice when it comes to the general election. And as soon as they can do that, the sooner they can do that, the better. Voter ID is another aspect of this as well. And again, cheese, you can smile for the camera there. 4 million eligible voters may not vote. 4 million people might not vote at the next general election because they do not have appropriate photo ID. Did anyone hear in the news a few weeks ago, whenever we had the elections on the 1st of May and around England and a few other elections, and our previous Prime Minister hadn't brought his photo ID, completely forgot to bring his photo ID to vote. And, granted that former Prime Minister is probably the one you might have expected would have forgotten to bring his ID, but not saying anything. Yeah, if it's as easy for him to forget to bring his photo ID as one of the people who introduced this to the country, then how easy is it for the rest of us to forget that we need to have appropriate photo ID? The reality is, it's not just about forgetting to bring it. A lot of people don't have it. And so it's making sure for them that we are helping them to find the photo ID or get them some photo ID so that they are able to vote. You think about it, a lot of people might have a passport, might have a driving license with a photo on it, they might have a blue badge, they might have a concessionary travel pass, and there's a few other bits of ID that you're allowed to use as well that have got a photo on them, even if it's expired. But as long as it looks like you and has the same name as you currently have, that's suitable to be used in going into a polling station. There's a lot of people who are at risk of not having those things, some of these things that we take for granted, not all people might have as easy access to them. I've got a list of some of them there. You might want to have a look at that if you can see it on your screen and think about, yeah, there are some people in our community who might apply in some of these cases. Are they someone that we could maybe encourage to get some photo ID and just remind them how to do it? On the next screen, we've got here some alternatives that you can have if you don't have photo ID. Well, one of the ways is to apply for a voter authority certificate. And unfortunately on my screen, I can just see an empty box where there should be a QR code, but you can also get that link on our website. So our jpit.uk/elections website webpage there. You can find out the links to apply for a voter authority certificate. That also requires you having a passport photo for that one. And if someone really doesn't want to have an ID card or can't get an ID card, there is also the option for them to apply for a postal vote. If that's possible, they need to do it a little bit more in advance. But if you have a postal vote, you do not need to have photo ID. That's exactly what I did in the 1st of May elections. I didn't need to use ID at all because I had my postal vote. We have this really handy poster that we produced last year whenever the law changed that meant you had to have photo ID to be able to vote in England, Scotland and Wales. And so this poster is still up to date now. You can download it from our website from the same page, jpit.uk/elections. And that's something you can put up in your church, in your notice board. Or what about, if you have the opportunity to put it outside your church building, somewhere where people are walking past, then they can easily be reminded of this as they walk past. We've got a color version and we've got a slightly less colorful version if you're the kind of person who weeps every time you've got to print out something in color because it's so expensive to do. But so we've got some great options there for you to get involved in this. And with that, I'm going to hand over to some more practicalities with Steve and Hustings.
Thank you. Thank you, Roo. One of the most common ways, I guess, churches engage in general elections are by arranging election meetings, and some of us know them as hustings, where members of the public can listen to and ask questions of the candidates who are standing for election. And they do this as a public service to support the democratic process, to facilitate public debate, and as a contribution to the common good. And this opportunity is for respectful discussion in a neutral space is often deeply appreciated by the candidates as well as the voters. So we have produced a comprehensive guide that is intended to help churches organise safe and successful events which comply with the law, and it's been produced by us in collaboration with a number of other churches and ecumenical bodies. So you can find this full guidance on our website, jpit.uk/elections/hustings, but it's also available in lots of other places as well. It's been really wonderful to work so collaboratively with these other churches. But essentially, it covers 4 areas that I'm just going to rattle through for you now. The first one is getting started. So it's encouraging you to start as soon as possible. We do not know when the election is coming, but we do know that it is coming at some time before January next year. And so it is a good opportunity to start doing this. In my experience, a number of churches like to use this opportunity, and it's a better thing to do it together than to wait until an election is called and then see which one of you can advertise your one first and turn it into a competition. So reach out to your other local churches and to any ecumenical groups that are local and start to form a planning group that can draw this all together, perhaps even include some from outside church life. Identify your constituency. You may be aware that a number of the constituency boundaries are changing at the moment. There's guidance in there's advice in the guidance as to how you can check up on that. But jpit.uk/constituency will take you to a Sky page that will help you with this as well. Pick a date. We normally recommend around a fortnight before the election is due, certainly more than a week before, but you can do it from any time, really. It's just to try and get it at a time when most people are thinking about this and deliberating over who they're going to vote for. And then choose an impartial chair, not just the most political person in your church. It may be the worst person to be a chair, but to find somebody that can be impartial, because it is really important that it abides by all the various election commission and charity commission laws. We'll talk about that in a moment. I just wanted to talk to you about the 4 different or the 5 different versions of a hustings that we want to commend to you, because I imagine if you've been involved in hustings, you might have an idea of what one looks like, but there are all sorts of approaches that you can take, and some have advantages and disadvantages around them. So the first one that we got is speed hustings. It's sort of based on the speed dating format, but I don't want to assume that you're all familiar with such things. So this type of hustings enables the primary dialogue to take place between the candidates and a group of constituents. So after a welcome and an introduction, individual candidates separately spend time at each table, allowing conversation to flow without candidates being able to directly address one another. And they can make a short introductory statement and then respond to questions from their groups before moving on to the next table, the next group of people, after a set amount of time. And the candidates could be invited to sum up with a short statement to the whole room at the end. Second version is the traditional hustings. I guess those of you that watch Question Time like me would be familiar with such a format. There's candidates are invited to respond to questions from the floor. So your chair might give a welcome, and the candidate might make a short opening statements. The candidates might make short opening statements. And then you would have questions from the floor on both local and national issues, although it's not a local election, so the question should be related to powers of Westminster Parliament. That's also worth bearing in mind if your churches are in Scotland and Wales. And then there might be some closing statements, but the timing is key in this version of it. Candidate statements and answers need to be strictly timed so that you've got enough time to get through as many questions as is possible, and they can be submitted in advance or on the day or taken from the floor, which perhaps is a little riskier because you want to cover a variety of subjects and not just be bamboozled by lots of people from one party that are all taking them along line. But there is plenty of information about that familiar version in the resource. Then there's online hustings, similar to the traditional one, but online. And so there are a few different formats that you consider. You could consider a live all online meeting, or you could live stream an in-person panel, or you could do a sort of hybrid of the two. But whatever you choose, the guidance is there to help you think things through, like numbers of attendees, subscriptions and time limits, whether you're streaming to social media. It'll help you think through the facilities, registration, hosting, timekeeping, online etiquette, all those sort of things. It goes into a lot of detail. The next one is a People's Politics election meeting, sometimes called a Citizens' Assembly. And here the emphasis is not so much on hearing from politicians and parties per se, but from those whose voices are not often heard within the political discourse, before asking candidates, of course, to respond to what they've heard. This is about equipping those with a story to share, those who use perhaps a local homeless shelter or a food bank, groups with perhaps learning disabilities, young carers, asylum seekers. Those that are on the fringes of the debate at most of the time can be empowered to tell their stories and then to seek responses from the candidates. This is a really powerful way of going about a hustings, but it does require a tremendous amount of thought and care given to those who are sharing their stories. A lot of pastoral responsibility lands on the shoulders of those organising it to make sure those sharing are doing so from their position of vulnerability, but protected as much as possible. And then there's the offline hustings. It's a sort of version of a hustings that doesn't require candidates and audiences to meet in the same physical space, but candidates are contacted with a range of questions by email, allowing them time to respond with a pre-arranged deadline and perhaps a word count, or if you're asking them to make videos, a video time limit. And then all the responses are published online in full. So those are a number of different approaches that you can take, and I'm sure you've got all sorts of questions around them, but I'd be surprised if they weren't answered in in the briefing, so please do download it. Then I'm just going to rattle through these last couple of bits because I want to allow as much time as possible for any questions. There's a lot of things about rules of hustings. Hustings need to be held, as I said earlier, in compliance with charitable law and electoral law, and that can sound daunting, but I would just say please don't panic. Everything that you need to think through is addressed in the resource, and there are links to signposted places like the Electoral Commission and the Charity Commission should you need more details. They are there. But essentially the key lesson is that hustings should not tip over into campaigning. Impartiality is key in the way that it is chaired, in the variety of questions asked, and so on. There's also some advice in there about who you invite to take part. We won't go into details again, but essentially you don't have to invite all the candidates, although if possible, it is normally advisable to do so. It's just sometimes that's impractical if you've got lots and lots of candidates and you're not going to be able to get through many questions. Then you just have to be able to give impartial reasons why you've not invited particular candidates. And there's advice in the resource about the various reasons why you might be able to exclude some and include others. And then there's some practical planning advice when to invite the candidates, essentially as soon as you know who they are. You'll find out who they are at the latest 19 days before the election. And that's the deadline when it's passed, and your local returning officer will publish the list of the candidates normally on your local authority website and in local notice boards where you live. You can also check it out on whocanivotefore.co.uk is an independent website that tells you, asks you to put in your postcode and will tell you all the candidates that are standing. There's also some phone numbers of the parties that you can call to get the contact details. There's advice on what to do if your candidate doesn't respond. There is advice on how to publicize your meeting. There's nothing more irritating for candidates than spending an evening in a very small audience at a hustings when they could be out campaigning. There's advice on hospitality, tea and coffee, welcome team, even giving gifts to the candidates. This photo was at a hustings that I did in 2019. It was at winter, and following JPIT's wonderful advice, I bought a pair of gloves for all the candidates because they were out doing their door knocking in bitter cold winter temperatures, and it added a bit of humour, but also a sort of a practical guide, a practical example of how we care about them, whatever parties they stand for. I think that's probably as much as I want to say. There's a quote here just from a URC minister that's trying to help you consider taking part. He says, I think it's fair to say that many of our churches have mixed experiences of hustings. As with any live debate, it can be a daunting experience for both hosts and candidates. But we've tried to include as much help as possible to resource to enable you to have as most positive and productive experiences you can. The minister says, I would encourage people to organise a hustings. It's well worth it. You'll need a team of cross-church people to make it work well. Start planning as soon as possible. Once you have the main parties in an area committed, the others will fall over themselves to come along. The candidates generally really appreciate the opportunity. It is a good opportunity to show that churches and Christians are interested and engaged in the wider world, and it's a good witness.
Thank you, everyone, for the good questions. And it is the nature of these things that we do end up getting into levels of detail. And hopefully you will find the resources on the website do answer your questions. But if not, then we're available on the phone and by email as well if you've got further questions afterwards. I do want to thank you for your time this evening and for engaging with this session. I hope you find some things of value for you and maybe have been sparked to think about some other things that you might do as a result. We will send a follow-up email probably tomorrow afternoon, which will have a link to the recording. So if you didn't manage to take notes, you can go back to that, and it will have links to the resources that we've mentioned this evening, and also a feedback form, because we always value hearing from you about whether these kind of events are helpful for you. Before we say good night, we just wanted to flag a couple of other events that we've got coming up. We've got a conference we're doing with Church Action on Poverty and the Applegate Collective happening in York on the 8th of June called Dignity for All, which is particularly about hearing the voices of those who are living with poverty and thinking and dreaming together about what we might do about that. And then on the 1st of July, we're hosting the annual Beckley Lecture, which always takes place as part of Methodist Conference, but is not only for people who are going to Methodist Conference. And this year, we're delighted that Emma Reevy, who's the Chief Exec of the Trussell Trust, will be talking alongside a lived experienced partner from the Trussell Trust about what it would take to end poverty in the UK. So it should be an excellent session, and you can join it online or join us in Leeds as well. So they're events that are coming up. I want to end by thanking my colleagues. You can see how much work has gone into preparing these resources for elections and for this evening. I'm hugely grateful to them as ever, and grateful to you all for your what you may well be doing in relation to this election. As we come to a close, I have got a prayer to share, which we wrote for the last general election, but I think doesn't date. So let us pray. Holy God, may we be campaigners with compassion and for your kingdom to come. Challenge us where our embedded ideologies rule us. Help us to hear the voices of those unlike us, and to listen to the silence where voices need to be raised up. Give us the wisdom to talk to those in power, and the gentleness to bless those who oppose us. Encourage us when we are weary of working for good, and enable us in all things to seek your will rather than our own authority. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Amen, and good night to you all.